Hello Internet, I'm the Disney Brain, and this is part 2 of RPM, the Nearly Perfect Season. Last time, we started breaking down the season by analyzing the first 5 episodes and what they all set up. Before we talk about the characters and their focus episodes in more depth, we'll break down a few more plot lines, including how the last 2 Rangers are introduced. After the 6 character-specific episodes, we get back to the continuing journey of Dylan trying to unearth his past. With that comes Blitz, an episode where Dylan has to literally choose between stopping an attack bot versus potentially reclaiming his old memories. It's a pretty simple setup and resolution as these things go, but what I liked about it is the way they give us bits and pieces of the story one step at a time. Since Dylan has now placed the goals of the team above his own, the story could have very easily taken a break from that subplot and focused on something else for a while. But since Venjix is Venjix, he won't give this team time to breathe, and instead forces the issue by looking to activate Dylan, otherwise known as Subject D44. And now the implants that made him one of the strongest Rangers on the team are the same ones that could potentially dismantle the team. So Dylan fights under the control of Venjix, and not even the power of friendship can save him. All the while, the show is carefully setting up another subplot prior to the Gem and Gemma reveal, and here's how. By this episode, we already know about Alphabet Soup, making Venjix's true origins dramatic irony for the rest of the cast. We also know, through that episode, that Doc K did have friends once upon a time, and in Brother's Keeper, even Ziggy is questioning Dr. K's insistence on calling everyone a Ranger Operator and not by their real names. And that's because her first 2 Ranger Operators, and also her only 2 real friends at that point, were thought lost to the Venjix attack, same as most of humanity. So K figures, why take the risk of getting personal with anyone ever again when they could die tomorrow? And the final tidbit we get in this episode is Dr. K revealing to the Rangers that she was responsible for the Venjix virus. And interestingly enough, by the start of the next episode, nobody beyond Dylan seems to have much of an issue with it. Summer inherently understood it as a mistake, and that's perfectly in line with her character, but part of it feels like since the team had already been through so much together, including a year of Ranger work for the original 3, dissension in the ranks wouldn't make a lot of sense, with the real enemies just over yonder. But they didn't just sweep that under the rug either, and instead made it so that Colonel Truman would be the one to make it into an issue several episodes later. And that makes much more sense for him, because his approach to protecting Corinth is very conservative and very risk averse, which is usually at odds with what Scott wants the Rangers to do. So if Scott understands, which he does, then the best way to handle this is for his father to act in the exact opposite fashion. But before any of that happens, the Rangers go on a 3-episode mission to Omega City, where they hope to uncover more about Dylan's past. We also get a cool nod to Engine Sentai here, with the Go-Anja rover vehicle they use for the trip. But more importantly, we're only about halfway into the season, and Venjix is making a statement to the Rangers by showing up for the first of several occasions in a real body. Here's what's great about this. We've had plenty of big bads before who never really change or adjust their predictable plans in response to their current adversaries. Villains who have had success before in other cities, other planets, other whole galaxies, but have never had to face the Power Rangers. So Venjix, for what is likely the first time, understands the elevated threat to his goals and responds accordingly. And the most interesting part about that comes more from Heroes Among Us later on, because despite Venjix being a computer virus, he is at times capable of acting rashly and impatiently, or, put another way, showing emotions. And because of that, one could view his new form as not just a tactical move, but also the feeling of wanting to personally destroy the Rangers. Those feelings of pride should, in theory, be incongruous with his programming. But he consistently proves that maybe that's not the case at all, and we'll discuss it further in his character breakdown. Getting back to the plot, the Rangers survive Venjix's initial assault. The next morning comes, and they decide to take it to Venjix, and from the fight arises 2 new Zords and 2 new Rangers. And we can already tell that there's something maybe a little, shall we say, different about the pair. The defeated Venjix returns to his giant tube and claims that he is immortal, something he mentions quite a bit. The title of the next episode is Ghosts, which I think could be a clever reference to the fact that Dr. K assumed Gem and Gemma were lost in action before their reemergence here, and the exchange we get between Flynn and Ziggy is just one of many examples as to how top shelf the RPM writing is. And how, while Dylan did a lot of the challenging early on as far as the Ranger status quo goes, Ziggy is just as capable of doing so, but in a much more comedic fashion. Ghost proves to be a pretty flawless Rangers episode, perfectly encapsulating everything RPM as a season does right, which is nearly everything, ergo the video title. In the previous episode, Venjix spoke of the Rangers walking into his greatest trap yet, and after some lighthearted fun, it's revealed that Venjix purposely implanted false memories into Dylan, thus making the team curious enough to travel way past the city limits, reducing their Ranger powers to bare minimum. 3 episodes of build-up for one brilliant mid-season villain scheme is exactly what you get when the showrunners demand excellence. The Rangers are blindsided by attack bots, and thankfully, Jem and Gemma are around to help save the day. But even after they escape, a bomb is planted on the back of the van. Although, they probably should have placed it on the front of the van for better results. Jem and Gemma later return to the fight and easily take out Venjix's latest attack bot. And finally, we have Jem and Gemma reunited with their old friend. And for the first time ever, Dr. K is openly emotional around the others. Ziggy quips about her trying out a new management style, which is another clever foreshadow towards the fact that Dr. K does soon after become more personable with the Rangers. This occurs near the beginning and end of the very next episode, where she tries to say something positive about everyone except Ziggy. And it's hard to fathom a more perfectly fitting moment than Dr. K attempting to compliment Dylan by starting with his psychological instability. Despite the oddity that defines her newfound complimentary attitude, you can always tell that she's trying her best to overcome her own sizable psychological hurdles. So when she says she loves the Rangers, you know she means it. That piece of development is a good place to dive into the central theme of RPM before tackling the final third of the story in part 3. And through that theme, we'll discuss the characters and how they each embody it. What the narrative of RPM teaches us is that in the wake of major change, we must adapt. We must change with it. In the face of great struggle, we must become the best possible versions of ourselves to survive and eventually to overcome. We talked about people changing people as it pertains to Jungle Fury, and we've got plenty of that here as well. But we also have forced change because the situation around you demands it from you. That's why a major aspect of the season is Scott challenging his father's stance and becoming more active in his role. In other words, forcing his own change, which leads Scott and the others to several more missions beyond the dome to bring the fight to Venjix and not wait for their extinction. However, in many respects, Colonel Truman is right, because if this were any other season, being more reactive and defensive would eventually work. But this isn't just another season, and Venjix isn't just another villain. He modifies, changes, and adapts his plans religiously, and without a more proactive approach, the Rangers could have easily been overwhelmed, or at the very least, fighting the same battles for 60 plus episodes with no end in sight. And part of that need to change and adapt also comes from Dylan, Ziggy, the twins, all of whom are unique characters that bring out new layers to the original 4 characters already fighting the good fight. These underlying narratives, building up the characters, helped make this team one of the greatest ever. And speaking of greatest ever, enter Summer Landsdowne. We see the theme of changing in response to the world around you within her the most. Her change is to such a high degree that current Summer is almost the complete opposite of pre-Venjix Summer. Emphasis on almost. She started out as your average everyday rich girl, but notice that her outward persona isn't completely defining of her, even back then. While she does act like a privileged princess, she doesn't fight like one or dirt bike like one, despite both of those activities being at odds with her initial perception. The point of it all is that she was always so much more than she seemed. All she needed was the right venue to showcase who she really was. Her butler Andrews always knew and was patiently putting up with her all this time so that she could finally show him one day. Sadly, she never got to. But I think it speaks to a much larger backstory that RPM didn't have time to delve into. Summer's parents were never around, so she filled the void with fake friends and material possessions. I think at some point early on, she just stopped caring about what really matters because her folks never seemed to. And then, the Venjix attack forces her to realize the painful truth that when things go to hell, all the money in the world might not save you, and fake friends certainly won't help you. And to make matters worse, Andrews died protecting her, forcing her to enter Corinth with nothing but the memory of a patient old man dying, but still waiting. Just like how I think Dylan's need to protect Ziggy derives from failing his sister, I think Summer's transformation from wannabe diva to does this girl even make mistakes is spurred on by losing Andrews. In that moment after entering Corinth and realizing someone's still out there, she rushes in to help. She becomes who she really is. Andrews no longer has to wait. And her focus episode is a great highlight on that end, because she firmly rejects her parents' ideas for getting their money back, and eventually, her parents kinda sort of understand where she's coming from. But what it symbolizes is Summer being able to prioritize the best parts about her, because that's what's needed against Venjix. Everything else is secondary. With the current Summer, you'd be hard pressed to find a single character flaw. She has an almost godlike balance of heart, sense, adaptability, personability, and when needs be, leadership. But RPM never makes the mistake of making her seem too perfect. And her feelings for Dylan tie it all together, because he's the real emotional connection that Summer had been missing all this time. And Dylan is basically the antithesis of the rich snob Summer's parents wanted her to marry, just to hammer the point home about how far she's come in just a year's time. Their dynamic is made to matter, not just because there's a romance blossoming, but also because the show never forgets to focus on it in subtle and overt ways, and it ends up feeling as natural as it possibly could, given the characters involved. And in the end, Summer helped save a man and a world that was worth saving. And even if Rangers last another 25 years, I still don't think there will ever be a Yellow Ranger as great as she is. Next, let's discuss Flynn McAllister. His trajectory is a bit more straightforward compared to the others, but I like the angle they took with him. His earnest embrace of comic book heroism worked like a downplayed version of Chip's best qualities. It makes him a very functional member of the team, but for the most part, the story doesn't demand too much of him compared to the others. And part of that definitely has to be Flynn having the least emotionally laden backstory of the bunch. It is interesting though, because past Flynn was a proven screw-up, but he gets picked for the Ranger job anyways, not accidentally recruited like Ziggy was, also a noteworthy screw-up. So I think part of his functionality comes from knowing his past and playing things close to the chest, because if he never overextends himself, then him being picked as a Ranger, which was probably life-affirming for him, would have been justified. So it seems to fit that his two focus episodes are all about properly extending himself, not by being a traditional comic book hero, but by being a mechanic, a more practical application of his largest knowledge base. Flynn doesn't need to prove that he can be like the heroes he reads about anymore. He's been doing that for over a year at this point, and has long since won the favor of his skeptical father. So allowing him to assist by using his mechanical know-how to adjust and invent Ranger powers works well. What's also fitting is that the one guy who wanted most to be a tight suit wearing hero is also the guy whose namesake episode answered all the fourth wall breaking questions. And in response to the post-morphing explosion inquiry, Flynn finds a way to use back explosions to dismantle enemies. You just know that somewhere out there, a single tear falls gracefully from Bruce Kalish's cheek as he quietly says, "Kalish explosions saved the day." But I also think there's a bit of a downside to using Flynn's development so practically. It means that he comes off as the least challenged among the team post-Venjix attack. He saved the day twice with his mechanical knowledge, but he already knew how to be a mechanic coming in. It's also strange that in one episode, Doc K is impressed with Flynn's mechanical know-how, but later on, she's extremely distrusting of it. I also can't help but think that Flynn really should have gotten the chance to shine as a more traditional hero as well, despite my previous points. If only to prove to himself that embracing the notion of self-sacrificing courage, especially in a world torn apart, still has its own merits, even if it is an old-fashioned notion. He got that in the first episode, but unlike the others, Flynn doesn't have much to do after his defining moment of characterization. Not even the implied romantic interest with Gemma goes anywhere. So I think it would have been par for the course to give him his old-fashioned true-to-form hero moment in the not spandex on top of the mechanical stuff. I think there would have been a great sense of humanity in that, to allow Flynn to basically have an early Connor moment, the difference being that Connor needed that moment. With Flynn, it's just who he is, a not-so-simple mechanic turned superhero. All in all, Flynn is a really good character. I just can't say he proves to be as good as the others, but the unique life and charm that Ari Boylan brought to this role is something I don't think will ever be matched. Now, let's talk about the leader of the gang, Scott Truman. Back when we talked about s.p.d, I mentioned how Jack was a so-so ranger but a really good character. Scott initially is exactly the opposite. Abrasive attitude, pulling rank repeatedly, and a seeming unwillingness to listen to anyone else. It was bad. And it really had me scratching my head too, because why would Kay choose him of all people to lead this team? Then I think back to the Doctor's single most defining trait. Everything she does has a reason. So of course she'd see a commanding, sure of himself almost to a fault presence like Scott and think, yes, this is manliness personified. But there's a logic behind it too. Even Princess Shayla was smart enough to appoint Taylor as leader initially because of her Air Force background. For as much as RPM makes jokes at its own expense, it too understands and respects the legacy of power, because there's no way that Scott's codename being Eagle 2 and Taylor being the Yellow Eagle is in any way coincidental, and that fight experience proved valuable in the field against Venjix. Even during heated battles, Scott was rarely phased and could always focus on his next order, a seemingly perfect soldier. But, just like with Skye, such a soldier inevitably comes with huge downsides, and even Scott admits to being extremely stubborn and set in his ways. The perfect way to develop such characters is to put them in positions where they feel powerless or are simply wrong. In comes Scott's focus episode, detailing his family dynamics and the truth behind Eagle 1, who was lost in action. It also doubles as a way to create characterization for Colonel Truman, whose authoritative nature now makes more sense. While Scott doesn't run his team any less authoritatively to start, I think in the back of his mind, he simply never wants to lose anyone again, same as his father. And more than anything, he wants his dad to recognize him for making a difference, and he wants to make his long-lost brother proud. And in comes maybe the greatest focus episode of all time, Heroes Among Us. An episode so unbelievably perfect that I made an entire video on it months ago. In it, Scott realizes the way he goes about doing things matters, and that being recognized in the wrong way isn't earned recognition. Before this point, and well after it, Scott often challenged his father's wishes. Even as the leader of the Power Rangers, Scott still feels like he needs to be heard. But what Scott also knows is that orders are orders for a reason, and that his heroic escapade could have ended very poorly. He thankfully doesn't suffer from the annoyingly overdone "it worked, didn't it" syndrome, indicative of results-oriented thinking. He instead recognizes that he can't accept this medal, or the proud father moment it signifies, until he's done something special, but in the right way. And we also got a little bit from Jem without Gemma needing to tag along, so points all around. I don't think Scott's a top 5 Red Ranger, but I would say he's up there with the 10 best at least. What separates him from potentially being Nick but worse is all about layers, and adding them where it counts. Everything about Scott is deeply tied into losing his brother, needing to impress his father, and needing to prove to himself that he can succeed. And in his own way, his own at times forced way, he proves that he does care. But since he's the leader, there's understandably a bigger weight he has to carry in this very heavy season. So he can't really turn off for that long, if at all, because if he does, Venjix might take someone else away. In line with that, and the central theme, he recognizes the need to change that Venjix is forcing upon them, and acts proactively in response, which leads to challenging his father very often, instead of just blindly following him. An atypical Ranger season needed an atypical approach, and because of Scott's desire to prove himself, he ended up going even beyond the hero his father always wanted. And even for as much as I praise Summer, I think Scott was the only Ranger operator who could have led this particular team, given what he brought to the table personally and professionally. And in the end, he did a damn fine job at doing just that. While Scott might have been born and bred for this job, good old Ziggy Grover was most certainly not. We've talked plenty about Rangers that shouldn't even be there, but in most of those cases, the Rangers in question always had the physical potential to be great. Ziggy is on a whole other lower level. He's closer to what would have happened if you gave early days Vulcan skull morphers. But from beginning to end, he constantly proves that his initial perception, even the one he has for himself, is far from the whole picture. In this season, against this villain, everyone was forced to be better, but none more so than Ziggy. And unlike Justin, Ziggy doesn't automatically gain girth when he morphs. He's more powerful, yes, but learning to direct that power was perhaps the biggest learning curve in all of Power Rangers. It starts from mere circumstance. Ziggy is tasked with Green Ranger recruiting, finds the perfect recruit, or so he thinks, and then he's forced to suit up as the only way to keep the morpher out of Tanaya's hands. It's such a perfectly conceived moment because Ziggy would strike you as the kind of person to run or hide or quit when things get dire, and there was that one time he did try to actually run away. But in his first real test, he manages to outwit one of Venjix's strongest creations simply by being Ziggy, and this works as a pretty good parallel to the events of Ranger Green, in which we learn the truth about Ziggy's bad reputation. Turns out, instead of doing his job, he did what was right. He did what was needed of him, just like every other ranger on his team. There's a reason Ziggy never quite fit in with the Scorpion Cartel. Those guys look out for themselves, but Ziggy is always looking out for others, and that's just how he's set up to start. One of the all-time best details that Power Rangers has ever given us is Ziggy's progression as a fighter. He's never really done it before now, and initially, he stinks at it. But over time, Ziggy works hard and is more than able to hold his own against opponents that would have surely crushed him prior to joining the team. Despite Dr. K's abrasive and dismissive attitude initially, despite the lack of confidence from his team initially, despite at times a lack of self-confidence, Ziggy becomes a hero. And what brought it all together was him eventually reconciling with Fresno Bob, who wanted him ghosted. They cleverly used Tenaya to reference Go for the Green, but instead of Ziggy using Bob to evade capture again, Ziggy saves Bob from Tenaya. In addition to an increased ability to kick butt, being a ranger also enhances Ziggy's natural ability to look past himself to save others, regardless of whether or not they deserve saving. This was the Ziggy version of Heroes Among Us, and fittingly, it ends with Ziggy earning the respect of Fresno Bob. Ziggy is humanity. Not the peak physical form of it, surely, but that's kind of the point. He's weak. He's frail. He doesn't know what he's doing most of the time, but he's trying. He's always trying, and with rare spirit. And it's so narratively appropriate that Dr. K of all people eventually sees that in him too. The cold, calculating, emotionally isolated doctor has a special place in that heart of hers for Ziggy. Given the way she ranks cuteness in her girl talk with Summer, Ziggy should be the last person she considers. It doesn't make any sense. And yet, here we are. The wit, the charm, the jokes, it's all a plus. But when it all comes down to it, Ziggy is as real of a ranger as we've ever gotten. A brilliant portrayal of the everyman, just trying to do what he can. Scott is supposedly perfect, Summer is actually perfect, Flynn is a heroic type, and Dylan is at the center of the biggest plot line. But Ziggy is just human. So to me, it makes perfect sense that upon rediscovering her own humanity, Doc K would gravitate towards his, realizing that even the most flawed human is better than a machine. Because of everything he is, and especially because of everything he's not, Ziggy is a perfectly flawed ranger, and I don't think we'll ever get another character quite like him. And in part 3, we'll finally discuss Dr. K herself, alongside Dylan, the twins, and the season as a whole. But until then, thanks for watching.